It was never inflation. That's where we need to start. Way back when, it was never inflation. Now, a lot of people said it was because they had been claiming inflation was going to break out any day now for the better part of a decade. And as soon as consumer prices went up, especially in early 2021, they said, aha, here it is. Inflation is finally here. And nobody bothered to ask, well, wait a minute, it took a decade for this inflation to finally show up? Instead, what everybody should have been asking was, what was different about 2021? It wasn't the Fed, it wasn't money printing or anything of the sort. It was the individual circumstances of that economy. But there were some things that were unfortunately familiar. Not inflationary things, but rather the opposite. From the very beginning, you could have known that it wasn't inflation in a couple different ways. One, the most obvious way, the one that I talk about, the one that Eurodollar University itself is mostly focused on, is the monetary system. Because money is inflation, inflation is money. If there isn't money, there isn't going to be inflation. And there wasn't ever enough money. We knew that from the markets. They told us. I've talked about this enough. That's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go talk about the other stuff. So from the monetary system perspective, inflation was off the table. But that didn't mean consumer price increases were. In fact, we saw consumer price increases, but we knew that it couldn't have been monetary inflation. Sorry, Emil, I hate that term. But either way, consumer prices increased for other reasons than money printing. And so we look to the economic data to tell us what those economic reasons were. Now, what I want to focus on here is a single data series that would have done everybody so much good had they just focused on this rather than the red hot rhetoric coming out of certain sectors of the peanut gallery. The series is produced by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the same folks, which are the same folks who do GDP. And it's called Real Personal Income Excluding Transfer Receipts. And this is one of those major, maybe unappreciated, not well-known economic data points, but the people at the NBER, for example, if that's your thing, this is one of the ones they look at when they say, are we in recession or not? And what it tells you is how much income the private economy is generating adjusted for prices. And from the very beginning, it has exposed these very stark differences in economic circumstances. We got to go back up a little bit here too. Before we ever got to 2020, if you looked at real personal income excluding transfer receipt, what you saw was the economy in the United States was generally solid and stable, even within and out of recession throughout the decades leading up to around 2008. All of a sudden in 2008, however, private incomes fell sharply and then never came back. See, they've lied to you all this time about a recovery. It never happened. Now, the economists and policymakers have put forward all sorts of explanations about why private income has never come back, why the labor market never actually recovered despite the unemployment rate. What we're really talking about here, and what this data series is really exposing, is the dark underbelly of the participation problem. Now, what economists have said repeatedly is that the participation problem is the fault of you and me, workers. We're either too lazy to go back to school and learn new skills that are employable in the modern marketplace, or we're all too drug addicted, hopped up on heroin or fentanyl or something else, or baby boomers are retiring in too great a numbers. Why baby boomers chose October 2008 to retire, they never really explain. But they've come up with all sorts of excuses other than to avoid having to say what is really the truth here. And Janet Yellen, more than anyone else, sort of let slip the truth many years ago during the first early days of her tenure when she said, boy, I look at this participation problem and I wonder maybe if this isn't some macroeconomic slack, if there really is an economic problem, not a blame American worker problem. And the funny thing is here, this income series shows the dark side, the downside of the participation problem, meaning the private economy was not generating nearly enough income to support economic recovery. And it didn't support economic recovery, going all the way back to that particular spot in history called the Great Recession, because it wasn't a recession. Instead, what it was, using the parlance of econometrics, it was a unit root, or a permanent shock. Something happened to the U.S. economy, specifically the labor market, which knocked it off of its multi-decade trend into a much lower state. Now, what possibly could that have been? It wasn't as if heroin was invented when Lehman Brothers collapsed. Oh, Lehman Brothers, that's a clue there. We had a monetary crisis, which, lo and behold, seemed to have produced the effects that economists have associated with monetary crisis for a very long time. You can go all the way back to John Maynard Keynes, and even before, when economists realized, Henry George. You have a deflationary money problem that leads to, among other things, the worst possible outcome, which is it hits the labor market. Labor market and deflation go together in the worst ways. So the economy never recovered after the 2008 recession because it wasn't a recession. It was a permanent shock due to the monetary crisis of 2007, 8, and 9. Fast forward to 2020, and what do we see again? Not just from this series, Real Personal Income Excluding Transfer Receipts, but more importantly, everything else. We see the participation problem, which was already an unfixed issue before we got to 2020, become even worse afterward. We have another monetary crisis in March of 2020, which only reminded businesses in the United States around the world how worthless the Federal Reserve is and how liquidity is always just a flip of a switch from turning off. It is an enormous... And then, of course, we can't forget the government restrictions overreacting to the pandemic itself, which meant more economic harm in these condensed spaces, condensed periods of time, which creates problems which reduce long-run capacity. That's the underlying issue here from after the unit root, the permanent shock after 2008, and then a second unit root or permanent shock in 2020. You see it in the data, you see it in the markets, but what you didn't see, or what most people focused on that was sort of different, was the government response after those things in 2020.